Today, Russia officially named the United Kingdom as a party to the conflict and openly threatens to strike London. Meanwhile, in the Kremlin, against the backdrop of the destroyed missile and space center, they stated that there will be no freezing of the war in Ukraine. Instead, there will be a total war. They also added that from now on, Russia is building a new world order together with Kim Jong-un. After the Times published an article stating that Ukraine has been using British drones for long-range strikes against Russia for 6 months now, the Kremlin could not hold back any longer. And today the head of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation, Sergei Lavrov, directly stated that the use of British missile forces in strikes on the territory of the Russian Federation can be regarded as, quote, participation in the war with all the consequences that follow from this. But what Moscow can actually do to the United Kingdom is another question, and the answer to it is much more modest than the loudest threat itself. In general, in this episode, we'll break down the whole picture from Lavrov's statement to sabotage in Europe and the result of the Ukrainian strike on the Russian space center. My name is Alexey Pechi. Let's analyze this topic together. But before we start, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to this YouTube channel. Check right now. Are you subscribed to this channel? Right below this video, see if the subscribe button is pressed. Maybe you're watching my episodes but still haven't subscribed. I know some of you are like that. I'd appreciate every subscription. So, let's start with the very statement containing threats against London from Moscow. Sergei Lavrov, the head of the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, commenting on Ukraine's use of British weapons, stated, and I quote, "You know, I feel sorry for Britain if it fights to the very end. We have the right to consider this proudly announced direct involvement of British missile forces in strikes against the Russian Federation as participation in the war, with all the consequences that follow from this." By the way, that's actually a wonderful wording. According to Lavrov, Britain has proudly and openly declared that it is involved in the war on Russian territory, and this is a direct sign that no one in Europe is afraid of these Russian clowns anymore. Only the unwashed Ivans can come into the comments and write about how Europe will get what's coming to it. Well, Europe will just strike a little with tactical nuclear weapons. It won't feel minor at all. Let me remind you, the full-scale phase of the war has already lasted more than 4.5 years. All your stories about how we haven't even started yet, they already make the civilized world laugh. The civilized world looks at you simply as some kind of clowns, as some kind of sideshow. And the reason for such statements by Sergei Lavrov was a publication in the Times that among the drones Ukrainian forces used to strike mainland Russia, there are British drones, including the jet-powered Neon drone developed by BAE Biosystems. I had a separate episode about this topic this morning. It's about drones, about Ukrainian missiles, so be sure to watch it. There I talked in more detail about these British drones. And after these reports, the Russian embassy in London has already threatened Britain with some kind of consequences. Let's be honest, did they really not know in Moscow that British drones were hitting them? Of course they knew, but they were afraid to react to it somehow. And when everyone started talking about it publicly, they were like, well, okay, we need to respond somehow. In response, the British Ministry of Defense stated that London is not even planning or considering reducing military support for Ukraine, and will continue to supply Kyiv with weapons and equipment necessary to defend against Russian aggression. Simply put, the British Ministry of Defense said, we don't care at all about the complaints of those Russians. Now let's try to answer the main question here. What can Moscow actually do in response to such statements from London, aside from Sergei Lavrov's words about, oh dear, there will be consequences? And here it's worth remembering that Sergei Lavrov has already been threatening Europe more than once in recent days, not to mention the threats from Putin, Medvedev and others like them, who throughout the full-scale war have been saying how they'll reach London and strike London. So shortly before this, Sergei Lavrov publicly stated that Russia, quote, will make its methods much tougher to destroy everything. that fuels Kiev's war machine from the west. And he added, quote, "And we are already doing this, they are already starting to groan." And against the backdrop of these statements, a wave of suspicious fires really swept across Europe. And against this backdrop, a wave of suspicious fires really swept across Europe. Recently, in the Baltic countries, Russians have been setting fire to logistics centers that provide humanitarian aid to Ukraine. Let me remind you, the most telling example was back in July. On the night of July 19th in Riga, the office, warehouse and logistics center of the charity organization Tavi Drogi burned down, which collected and sent humanitarian aid to Ukrainian soldiers and civilians. According to surveillance camera footage, two masked individuals entered the premises by climbing over the fence. They set the building on fire and escaped before the security arrived. The damage was estimated at almost 100,000 euros, and donated equipment, clothing and food were destroyed in the fire. And the Latvian State Security Service stated directly that, considering the sabotage activities Russia has organized in Latvia and other NATO and EU countries in recent years, the possibility that the arson was carried out in Russia's interests cannot be ruled out. Plus, today in Estonia it was also announced that one of these same charity centers was set on fire. And then in Latvia there was also a statement that there was a similar act of sabotage at a similar humanitarian warehouse. And a similar incident happened in Italy, at the KNDS ammunition factory. But the Italian company, which by the way is also a subsidiary of BAE Systems, supplying products to Ukraine, there was also an explosion, and the Italian prosecutor's office is investigating its possible connection with similar incidents at facilities in Bulgaria. On August 10th, an arms factory caught fire there as well. So yes, Russia is indeed capable of such targeted sabotage, arson at warehouses, explosions at factories working for Ukrainian defense, drone launches, like what happened in Leipzig, which landed next to a Ukrainian plane, and so on. But still, this is a completely different level of threat than, as Lavrov says, participation in the war with all the resulting consequences, well, which Lavrov threatens the whole of Britain with. To directly attack a NATO country with nuclear weapons and a permanent seat on the UN Security Council, Russia is not capable of that and understands this perfectly well itself. Hence the gap between the loudness of the rhetoric and the actual set of available tools. Covert sabotage, not open confrontation, is all that Russia can do. And Russians act like cowards, just like some kind of rats. They set fire to warehouses and don't even admit it. They just can't. But the British, they came out and proudly said, Lavrov says, they came out and proudly said, yes, we are giving Ukraine drones, which it uses to strike mainland Russia and attack targets there. Yes, we are doing this. Yes, and we will continue to do this. Not secretly, we're not hiding it at all. We openly supply weapons to the Ukrainians, which are then used to strike Russia. In response, the Russians act like rats, like real cowards. Not even by themselves, but they bribe certain Europeans to set fire to some warehouse. And then they say, well, you see, we got our revenge. So, what can you expect? Maybe you can expect some arson attacks in Britain itself, and even that is questionable. And against this background, various Russian Ivans come into the comments, including under my videos. And after 4.5 years of full-scale war, they still keep writing that Russia hasn't even started yet. And soon it will strike Europe with tactical nuclear weapons. You don't understand. Putin is just getting ready. I don't know, I'm just curious. Don't Russians themselves find these statements kind of funny? They still, just think about it, they still do. Even when oil depots are burning, refineries, just factories all over Russia. When several hundred drones fly to Russia overnight, they still say, we haven't even started yet, just wait until we do. Guys, wake up, I think you've messed up. And against this backdrop, the Kremlin made it clear on the same day that there would be no talk of peace or even a pause in hostilities. Yuri Ushakov, assistant to the bold dictator Vladimir Putin, responded briefly when asked about the desire of several countries to freeze the war along the line of contact. You know our position, it rules that out. He also noted that real diplomacy is always conducted quietly, and what is done loudly is just public statements. Earlier, let me remind you, Russia put forward demands: no freezing without addressing, as they say, the root causes of the war. In other words, essentially, without fulfilling Moscow's maximalist demands. Let me add that the only root cause of this war, no, let's put it this way, there are two real root causes of the war: Russia and Putin. Let's eliminate both, and the war will end. But instead of peace with Ukraine, Sergei Lavrov on the same day preferred to talk about a new alliance with North Korea. Yes, he called it a new alliance because when there are no achievements, you have to make them up. In a telegram to his colleague from the DPRK, Choi Son-hee, on the occasion of Korea's Liberation Day from Japanese invaders, he wrote, and here is a quote from Lavrov: "Today, Moscow and Pyongyang are standing together as a united front for the creation of a new, just world order, based on the principles of multipolarity, genuine equality, and consideration of national interests." He also recalled the joint operation to, and I quote, "expel the armed forces of Ukraine and foreign mercenaries from the Kursk region, as a continuation of the tradition of military camaraderie since 1945. And, well, the price of this camaraderie is well documented. According to South Korean military intelligence, Pyongyang supplied the Russian army with more than 12 million artillery shells and sent about 13,000 soldiers to the Kursk region, of which about 2,500 were killed, and there were also some wounded. According to Bloomberg's estimates, since 2022, North Korea has earned more than $14 billion from military aid to Russia, including $850 million from the export of soldiers themselves, that is, cannon fodder. And the cooperation continues to expand. Just recently, the president of Ukraine, Vladimir Zelensky, stated that North Korea plans to deploy a group of 30 to 50,000 military personnel in Russia. And Ukrainian intelligence reported Pyongyang's plans to send a missile unit to the Voronezh region. That's 6 launchers and about 120 ballistic missiles. According to Kyiv, this year North Korea has already transferred 40 short-range ballistic missiles KN-23 and KN-24 to Russia. And Zelensky confirmed at the end of July that they're already being used for strikes against Ukraine. But it's funny that at the beginning of the full-scale war, Vladimir Putin insisted and proudly said that he was building a new world order with China and with all the BRICS countries. Just remember that rhetoric. And now, in 2026, the Kremlin is ready to build that very same new world order, well, at least with North Korea, with whoever they can. So, that's the kind of interesting world order we are going to have. But behind all this bravado, there is the reality on the ground, as Putin likes to say. On the night of August 15, let me remind you, Ukrainian defense forces struck the Russian rocket and space center Progress in Samara with Flamingo missiles. This is the only enterprise in the country engaged in the serial assembly of Soyuz 2 launch vehicles. The distance from the Ukrainian border to the plant is about 900 kilometers. And today, on August 18, satellite images have appeared showing that the strike hit building 106A. This is the part where, in a clean room, they assemble the so-called nervous system of the launch vehicles. This includes the onboard electronics, instruments, control system and cable network. Without this stage, it's simply impossible to assemble a rocket, even if you have the body, tanks and everything else ready. Without this, it's just not possible. Restoring such a facility, according to analysts, will take months due to the specifics of the clean room. The thing is, the fire, soot and water flooding, well, in order to extinguish the fire, mean that the clean zones need to be requalified and the entire technical process has to be recertified. The situation for Russia is further complicated by sanctions, because the onboard electronics of these Soyuz launch vehicles are highly dependent on imported components, access to which is restricted. And most likely, these components were also damaged after this attack. The strategic importance of this plant is also enormous. There are no duplicate production facilities in Russia. It is here that the entire line of Soyuz 2 rockets is assembled, which Russia uses to launch military electronic intelligence and target designation satellites into orbit. And importantly, the satellite internet system Rassvet. This is the Russian equivalent of Starlink, which, as we discussed in previous episodes, is deployed exclusively by Soyuz 2.1B launch vehicles. It is supposed to allow Russian forces to control drones in real time across the entire territory of Ukraine. To be continued. In summary, Russia calls Britain a participant in the war and threatens some kind of consequences, but the real arsenal of tools available to it is sabotage. Well, like setting fire to humanitarian aid warehouses or explosions at weapons factories, rather than any kind of direct confrontation with a NATO country. At the same time, the Kremlin cynically closes the door to any freezing of the conflict and publicly strengthens its alliance with North Korea. Instead of taking real steps toward peace, and at the same time, one of the few irreplaceable enterprises supporting the country's space and missile program is hit inside Russia itself. In other words, Ukraine is showing that it can strike deep inside the territory much more precisely and painfully than any of Sergei Lavrov's verbal threats against London. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell. And don't forget to like the video. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.